The day I was certain and wrong. I remember the exact chair I was sitting in. Grey fabric, slightly worn on the left armrest, in a conference room on the 14th floor with a view of a parking structure instead of a skyline. I remember this because I have replayed that meeting more times than I have replayed anything else in my adult life, searching for the moment where I could have stopped what was coming. I was 34 years old, and I had just told a room of 9 people that a decision was safe. Not probably safe. Not safe under most conditions I can imagine. Safe. I used that word, unqualified, in front of people who trusted my judgment because I had earned a reputation for being right. I had data. I had done the analysis 3 times. I had run the numbers past 2 people I respected, and both had nodded. I felt, in the specific and dangerous way that certainty feels, absolutely clear. 11 weeks later, that decision cost the company more money than I made in 4 years of salary, and it cost several of the people in that room their jobs. Not mine. That's its own kind of injustice I've had to sit with, but theirs. I watched people who trusted my confidence pay for the gap between how sure I sounded and how sure I actually had any right to be. Here is the part that took me over a year to understand, and it's the part this entire audiobook is built around. I wasn't stupid. I wasn't lazy. I hadn't skipped steps out of arrogance or hidden anything out of malice. I had done almost everything a diligent, intelligent person is taught to do. And it still went catastrophically wrong, because the thing that failed wasn't my effort. It was my thinking. Specifically, it was the invisible architecture behind how I arrived at conclusions, an architecture I had never once, in 34 years, been taught to examine. Most people assume critical thinking is something you either have or you don't, a kind of intelligence bonus feature that shows up in people who read a lot or scored well on standardized tests. I believed that too, right up until my own thinking, sharpened by education and experience, produced a conclusion so wrong it altered the lives of people I cared about. What I discovered afterward, digging through decades of research in cognitive psychology and decision science, is that critical thinking isn't a trait. It's a set of specific, learnable operations, and most of us are running our entire adult lives without ever installing them. This is not an audiobook about being smarter in some abstract sense. Intelligence, it turns out, has surprisingly little to do with the quality of the decisions we make. Some of the most catastrophic reasoning failures in modern history were produced by rooms full of extraordinarily intelligent people. What separates a good decision from a bad one is not raw cognitive horsepower. It's whether you know how to interrogate your own certainty before the world does it for you. Over the next several hours, I'm going to walk you through everything I had to learn the hard way, the biases that hijack judgment before you're aware they're operating, the difference between confidence and accuracy, the discipline of slowing down at exactly the moment your brain wants to speed up, and the specific mental tools that separate people who think clearly under pressure from people who simply sound like they do. This is drawn from the research of scientists who spent careers mapping exactly how human judgment breaks down: Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, Gerd Gigerenzer, Philip Tetlock, and from philosophy that has, for over 2,000 years, wrestled with the question of how a mind can know what it actually knows. I am not going to tell you that thinking clearly is easy, because it isn't, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But I can tell you it's learnable. I know because I had to learn it after the fact, rebuilding my own judgment from the wreckage of a decision I was certain about. By the end of this, you'll have the same architecture I built, one interrogation, one habit, one mental model at a time. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth about why you were wrong the last time you were certain, and didn't know it. Before we dive in, I want to know where you're actually starting from, because the honest answer changes everything about how this lands for you. Drop your answer in the comments right now. When was the last time you were completely certain about something and turned out to be wrong? Just describe it in one word. The feeling, the topic, anything. I read every single one. If you're the kind of person who takes their own mind seriously enough to actually examine it, hit subscribe. It tells the algorithm to keep sending you content built for people who think, not people who scroll. Why your brain prefers a good story over the truth. There is a particular kind of silence that happens in a room when someone tells a story that makes sense. Not a story that's true, a story that makes sense. The two get confused constantly, and the confusion is not a personal failing. It's architecture. In the late 1960s and through the 1970s, two Israeli psychologists named Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky began a body of research that would eventually reshape economics, medicine, law, and public policy. Their central discovery, stripped down to its simplest form, was this: human beings do not evaluate the world by calculating probabilities. We evaluate the world by matching what we are seeing to a story we already recognize, and the more coherent that story feels, the more true we assume it is. Kahneman later called this system one thinking: fast, automatic, emotional, and almost entirely blind to its own operation. Here's what makes this dangerous rather than merely interesting. System 1 doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, I am now constructing a plausible narrative based on limited information and calling it a conclusion. It simply produces the conclusion, fully formed, and hands it to your conscious mind dressed up as insight. You experience it not as a guess but as knowing. That feeling of knowing is one of the most convincing sensations the human brain can produce, and it is almost completely unrelated to whether the thing you know is correct. Consider the meeting I described a moment ago. I didn't arrive at this decision is safe through some corrupted, obviously flawed process. I arrived at it because the story fit. Previous decisions like this one had gone well. The people advising me were smart and had also seen a pattern. The narrative, cautious growth, calculated risk, informed by experience, was coherent, and coherence felt like proof. What I didn't do, and what almost none of us do instinctively, is ask whether the coherence of a story has anything to do with its accuracy. It doesn't. A well-constructed lie is often more coherent than a messy, complicated truth, because reality rarely organizes itself into a clean narrative arc. Kahneman and Tversky gave this phenomenon a name that has since entered mainstream vocabulary: the availability heuristic, closely tied to what they called the what you see is all there is principle, often shortened to WSATI. Your brain builds conclusions almost exclusively from the information sitting in front of it in that moment, and it does this without checking whether that information is representative, complete, or even remotely sufficient. If a story can be built from the available pieces, the mind builds it, commits to it, and defends it, often within a fraction of a second, and almost always before your slower, more deliberate reasoning has had a chance to weigh in. This is why intelligent people are not protected from bad thinking. Intelligence, in the traditional sense, is largely about how well you can build and defend an argument once you have a conclusion. It says almost nothing about how good you are at noticing that your conclusion arrived too fast, built from too little, dressed up as certainty it hadn't earned. In fact, in some of Kahneman's later work, he found that highly intelligent, highly articulate people were often better at constructing convincing justifications for flawed intuitive judgments, not because they reasoned more carefully, but because they were more skilled at making a fast, biased conclusion sound like the product of careful thought. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it undoes a comforting assumption most of us carry. We tend to believe that if we are careful, if we are smart, if we take our time, our conclusions will be sound. But the research shows something more unsettling. The feeling of having taken your time, of having been careful, can be manufactured after the fact by a mind that already decided in an instant and is now building the scaffolding to justify what it already believes. The story comes first. The reasoning arrives afterward. dressed up as the cause. So what do we do with this? The goal is not to distrust every instinct you have. Intuition, properly earned through genuine expertise, is one of the most powerful tools the human mind possesses. Gerd Gigerenser's research on what he calls fast and frugal heuristics shows that experienced professionals, firefighters, chess masters, emergency room doctors, often make remarkably accurate snap judgments precisely because their intuition has been trained by thousands of hours of feedback in a stable, learnable environment. The problem isn't intuition itself. The problem is trusting intuition in exactly the situations where it hasn't been earned. Novel situations, high-stakes situations, situations where feedback is slow, ambiguous, or non-existent. The decision that cost me and my colleagues so much wasn't a domain where I had thousands of hours of calibrated feedback. It was closer to novel territory dressed up in familiar language. My intuition felt earned because the situation resembled ones I'd handled before. It wasn't, in the ways that mattered most. And because the story felt coherent, I never stopped to ask the one question that might have changed everything. Does this feeling of certainty actually correspond to evidence, or does it just correspond to a good story? That question, does this feeling of knowing actually track the truth, is the first tool of critical thinking, and it is almost never asked in the moment it matters most, because by definition, the moment it matters most is the moment your brain feels most certain. We'll come back to specific techniques for asking that question under pressure. For now, I want you to simply notice, over the next day, how often a conclusion arrives in your mind wearing the costume of certainty before you've actually checked its credentials. You'll be surprised how often it happens, and how convincing it feels every single time. The architecture of a bad decision. If you dissect almost any catastrophic decision after the fact, a failed product launch, a doomed merger, a relationship that collapsed after years of ignored warning signs, you rarely find a single dramatic error. You find a structure. A sequence of small, individually reasonable-seeming steps that compound into something none of the individual actors would have chosen if they'd seen the whole picture at once. This is one of the most important reframes in decision science, and it comes largely out of research into what's sometimes called decision architecture. The idea that outcomes are shaped less by the intelligence of the decision-maker and more by the structure surrounding the decision itself. Herbert Simon, the economist and cognitive scientist who won a Nobel Prize for his work on decision-making, introduced a concept called bounded rationality back in the 1950s. His argument was simple but radical for its time. Human beings are not capable of the kind of unlimited, perfectly rational calculation that classical economic theory assumed. We operate under limits, limits of time, limits of information, limits of cognitive capacity. And because of those limits, we don't actually optimize decisions. We satisfice. We settle for the first option that seems good enough, given the constraints we are under, and then we convince ourselves it was the best option available. Understanding bounded rationality changes how you look at your own bad decisions, including the ones that haven't happened yet. It's tempting, after a failure, to ask, how could I have been so stupid? That question assumes the failure was a character flaw. The more useful question, the one decision scientists actually study, is, what did the architecture of that decision make easy, and what did it make hard? Because in almost every case, the structure of a decision, who was in the room, what information was surfaced first, how much time existed to think, what the incentives of everyone involved happened to be, did more to shape the outcome than any individual's raw judgment. Let me walk you through the specific architecture that produced my own failure, because I think you'll recognize pieces of it in decisions you've made too. First, there was time pressure, not extreme, not obviously reckless, but enough that let's take another week to verify this felt like an indulgence rather than a necessity. Second, there was social proof. 2 respected colleagues had nodded along, and their agreement functioned, in my mind, as a substitute for independent verification, even though neither of them had actually run the numbers themselves. They were nodding at my confidence, not at underlying evidence they checked. Third, there was what psychologists call the sunk cost architecture. I had already spent weeks building the case, and abandoning it at the final stage felt like wasting that effort, even though the effort already spent had no bearing whatsoever on whether the conclusion was correct. And fourth, there was authority. I was the person in the room whose job it was to know, and the discomfort of saying I'm not sure from that position felt, at the time, more costly than being wrong. None of these four elements, on their own, would have produced a disaster. Time pressure alone is manageable. Social proof alone is often useful information. Sunk cost thinking is a known bias most people can catch if they're looking for it. Positional authority is simply part of having a job. But stacked together, unexamined, they created an architecture where the path of least resistance and the path of greatest confidence pointed in exactly the same wrong direction. And because nothing about that architecture felt unusual, it felt like an ordinary Tuesday in an ordinary conference room. Nobody in the room, including me, thought to ask whether the structure itself was distorting our judgment. This is the pattern researchers have found again and again when they study organizational failures, from the Challenger space shuttle disaster to corporate financial collapses. Diane Vaughan's landmark study of the Challenger explosion introduced a phrase that has stuck with me since I first read it: the normalization of deviance. Small departures from a safe standard, repeated without consequence, gradually redefine what counts as normal, until people are operating well outside a safe boundary while genuinely believing they're still inside it. Nobody at NASA decided, in a single moment, to accept a catastrophic risk. A long sequence of individually defensible decisions slowly moved the boundary of acceptable risk, and by the time the boundary had moved far enough to matter, it no longer looked like a boundary at all. It looked like standard procedure. The reason this matters for you, in your own life and decisions, is that it reframes the entire project of critical thinking. You cannot simply resolve to think more carefully in the moment a bad decision is forming, because by the time you're in that moment, the architecture has already done its work, the time pressure is already present, the social proof has already landed, the sunk costs have already accumulated. Critical thinking, done well, is not primarily a skill you deploy in the moment of decision. It's a set of structural habits you build in advance, so that when the pressure arrives, the architecture around you is already built to catch what your instincts alone would miss. That means learning to ask, before you're inside a high-stakes decision, a small set of standing questions. What would make me change my mind here, and have I actually looked for that evidence, or only for evidence that confirms what I already believe? Who in this room actually has independent information, versus who is simply agreeing with the loudest confident voice? What would this decision look like to someone with no time pressure, no sunk cost, and no personal stake in being right? These questions feel almost too simple to matter. In practice, they are the single most reliable defense against the exact architecture that produced my own worst decision, and countless decisions made by people far more careful than I believed myself to be. Confidence is not evidence. There is a particular voice tone that human beings across virtually every culture associate with trustworthiness. It's steady, unhurried, free of hedging language. We hear it and something in us relaxes, because that voice sounds like it knows. Politicians use it. Expert witnesses use it. Doctors use it. I used it, in that conference room, because I believed, sincerely, that I had earned the right to sound that certain. Here is the finding from decision research that should unsettle anyone who has ever trusted a confident voice, including their own, across dozens of studies spanning medicine, finance, forensic science, and eyewitness testimony. The correlation between how confident a person sounds and how accurate they actually are is shockingly weak. In some domains, it's close to zero. In a few well-documented cases, it's actually negative, meaning the most confident-sounding experts were, on average, slightly less accurate than their more hedged, more careful-sounding colleagues. This isn't a minor academic curiosity. It strikes at something most of us use, every single day, as our primary tool for evaluating who to trust, the sound of certainty. We assume that people who are unsure sound unsure, and people who know sound like they know. But confidence, it turns out, is generated by a completely separate psychological process from accuracy. Confidence tracks how coherent a story feels, how much practice someone has at telling it, and how little conflicting information they've been exposed to. Accuracy tracks whether the story is actually true. These two things frequently travel together, which is exactly why we've learned to trust the pairing. But they are not causally linked, and when they diverge, the results can be devastating. Philip Tetlock, a psychologist who spent over 2 decades studying the accuracy of expert political and economic forecasts, produced one of the most sobering findings in the entire field of decision science. He tracked tens of thousands of predictions made by professional pundits, analysts, and experts over 20 years, and compared their accuracy against simple chance. The result, published in his book Expert Political Judgment, was that the average expert performed barely better than random guessing, and critically, the experts who were most confident, most quoted in media, and most certain in their delivery were, on average, among the least accurate. Tetlock later called this pattern hedgehogs, thinkers who explain the world through one big, coherent idea, applied confidently and consistently. He found that hedgehogs made for compelling television and terrible forecasts. The thinkers who actually performed well, the ones Tetlock called foxes, shared a very different profile. They held their beliefs loosely. They updated frequently in response to new evidence. They spoke in probabilities rather than certainties, using language like "I'd put that at maybe 60% instead of "that's definitely going to happen." And crucially, they were comfortable being visibly uncertain in public, which, ironically, is exactly the quality that makes an expert sound less trustworthy to an audience trained to associate hedging with weakness. This creates a genuine and uncomfortable problem for anyone trying to think clearly, because the world rewards the hedgehog and punishes the fox. Confident, simple, certain narratives get promoted, quoted, and believed. Careful, hedged, probability-based thinking gets dismissed as wishy-washy, indecisive, or weak. I felt this pressure myself in that conference room. Saying I'm about 70% confident this is safe, with meaningful downside risk in 3 specific scenarios would have been more accurate, more honest, and far less persuasive than the flat, confident this is safe I actually delivered. I chose the version that sounded like leadership. It was, in fact, the less rigorous of the two. Learning to separate confidence from evidence starts with a simple but genuinely difficult habit. Before accepting any conclusion, your own or someone else's, ask specifically what evidence produced that level of certainty, rather than what tone of voice accompanied it. This sounds obvious stated plainly, and it is almost never done in practice, because tone processes faster than content. You register how someone sounds before you've consciously evaluated what they've actually said, and that first impression colors everything that follows. There's a practical technique researchers in this field often recommend, sometimes called calibration training. It involves deliberately attaching a numeric probability to your beliefs. Not just "I think this will work," but "I'm about 75% confident this will work," and then, crucially, tracking those numbers over time against actual outcomes. Most people, when they start this practice, discover something humbling. Their 80% confidence predictions come true far less than 80% of the time. This is called overconfidence calibration, and it's one of the most consistently replicated findings in judgment research. We are, almost universally, more certain than our track record justifies, and we rarely find out, because most of us never bother to check. I now keep an actual, literal record, nothing sophisticated, Just a simple note where I write down significant predictions I make, along with a confidence percentage, and I review it every few months. It is one of the most quietly humbling exercises I've ever adopted, and it has done more to recalibrate my relationship with my own certainty than any book or lecture. You don't have to build an elaborate system. You simply have to start noticing the gap between how sure you feel and how sure your track record actually says you should be. That gap, once you can see it clearly, becomes one of the most valuable pieces of information you'll ever have about your own mind. The discipline of slowing down. If everything I've described so far sounds like an argument for permanent hesitation, for never trusting a conclusion, never acting with conviction, second-guessing every instinct into paralysis, that's not the goal, and it's worth being precise about why. The goal isn't slower thinking in general. It's knowing exactly when to slow down, because most of your daily decisions genuinely don't require it, and the handful that do are usually disguised as ordinary moments. Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 framework is useful here again, but the part most people skip past is the practical question. How do you know, in real time, which system should be running the show? You can't consciously slow down every decision. Deciding what to eat for breakfast doesn't need a probability assessment, and treating it like one would be its own kind of dysfunction. The discipline isn't universal slowness. It's a trained sensitivity to specific signals that indicate a decision has crossed from low stakes and reversible into high stakes and consequential. There's a useful mental checkpoint that decision researchers have converged on from several directions, sometimes summarized as the reversibility test. Before committing to a conclusion, ask, if this turns out to be wrong, how easily can it be undone, and how much does it cost to find out? Decisions that are cheap to reverse, trying a new vendor for a small project, testing an idea on a small scale before scaling it up, don't need extensive deliberation, because the cost of being wrong is low and the information you gain from acting is often more valuable than the analysis you do instead. Jeff Bezos, in his early writing about decision-making at Amazon, called these two-way door decisions, distinct from one-way door decisions that are expensive or impossible to reverse. The entire discipline of slowing down comes down to correctly sorting which door you're walking through before you walk through it. My decision in that conference room was, unmistakably, a one-way door. It couldn't be tested at small scale. It couldn't be quietly undone if it turned out wrong. And yet I treated it, psychologically, with the same fluency and speed I'd bring to a two-way door decision, because it arrived wearing the same emotional texture as dozens of smaller decisions I'd made successfully before. Nothing about the moment announced itself as unusually consequential. That's precisely what makes one-way door decisions dangerous. They rarely come labeled. Beyond the reversibility test, there's a second checkpoint worth building into your default thinking, one drawn from research on what's sometimes called the pre-mortem technique, developed by psychologist Gary Klein. Instead of asking, before a decision, what could go wrong, which tends to produce vague, easily dismissed answers, Klein's method asks you to imagine the decision has already failed, a year in the future, and to work backward. Given that this failed, what most likely caused it? This small reframing, treating failure as a known fact rather than a hypothetical possibility, bypasses a huge amount of the optimism and motivated reasoning that normally protects a plan from honest scrutiny. Research on premortems has found they surface risks that standard risk assessments consistently miss, precisely because imagining a failure as already real removes the psychological incentive to defend the plan. Had I run even a rough version of a premortem in that conference room, had someone asked the room to imagine, concretely, that the decision had already failed, and to explain why, I believe at least one of the specific failure modes that actually occurred would have surfaced. Not because anyone in that room lacked the intelligence to see it. Because nothing in the structure of that meeting asked anyone to look for it. We were optimizing, unconsciously, for confirming the plan rather than stress testing it. and confirmation is the natural default direction of a mind under time pressure. The discipline of slowing down, then, isn't a personality trait some people have and others lack. It's a small set of triggers and checkpoints, built in advance, that interrupt the automatic momentum of a fast, confident conclusion at exactly the moments that momentum is most dangerous. Ask whether this is a one-way or two-way door. If it's one-way, run a pre-mortem, even an informal one, even just in your own head. Imagine the failure as already real, and ask what caused it. And notice, specifically, whether the certainty you're feeling has been tested against disagreement, or whether it has simply gone unchallenged because nobody in the room felt authorized to challenge it. None of this requires becoming a slower, more anxious version of yourself. It requires becoming a more selective one, fast and intuitive where speed is safe, deliberately, uncomfortably slow at the specific junctures where the cost of being wrong is high and the door, once walked through, doesn't open back up. In the next part, we are going to build the specific interrogation tools you use once you've identified that a belief deserves scrutiny, starting with the single most powerful question in the entire discipline of critical thinking, one I wish someone had taught me before that meeting instead of after it. How to interrogate a belief you're sure of. Julia Galef, a researcher who has spent years studying the psychology of belief formation, describes two fundamentally different mindsets a person can bring to their own convictions. She calls the first the soldier mindset, a way of relating to your beliefs where the job is to defend them, protect them from attack, and treat any evidence against them as an enemy to be repelled. She calls the second the scout mindset, a way of relating to your beliefs where the job is to map the terrain accurately, regardless of whether the map confirms what you hope to find. Almost everyone believes they operate as a scout. Almost everyone, under actual pressure, operates as a soldier. I want to give you a specific tool for catching the difference in real time, because knowing the concept intellectually and catching yourself in the act are two entirely separate skills. The tool is a single question, and it is, without exaggeration, the most powerful sentence I know in the entire discipline of critical thinking. What would have to be true for me to be wrong about this? Notice what this question does that most self-scrutiny doesn't. It doesn't ask you to doubt yourself in some vague, anxious way. It doesn't ask you to abandon your conclusion. It asks you to specify, concretely, the conditions under which your conclusion would fail, and then to go check, honestly, whether any of those conditions are present. This is a version of what philosophers of science call falsifiability, a principle formalized by Karl Popper in the 20th century as the dividing line between genuine knowledge and unfalsifiable belief. A claim that cannot, even in principle, be proven wrong isn't a strong claim. It's an empty one, dressed up in the language of certainty. When I ask myself this question about the decision that went wrong in that conference room, the answer arrives almost instantly, and it's humiliating in its simplicity. What would have to be true for me to be wrong? The two colleagues who nodded would have to be agreeing with my confidence rather than independently verifying my data. The pattern I was relying on from previous decisions would have to not actually apply to this specific, differently structured situation. The timeline pressure I felt would have to be self-imposed rather than genuinely externally forced. Every single one of those conditions, it turned out, was true. And every single one was checkable, in advance, by someone willing to ask the question honestly instead of defensively. Here's why this question works when so many other forms of self-doubt don't. It converts a vague, uncomfortable feeling, maybe I should double-check this, into a specific, falsifiable checklist. Vague doubt is easy to dismiss, because it doesn't point anywhere. Specific doubt, in the form of concrete conditions you can go verify, is much harder to wave away, because it either checks out or it doesn't, and you now know which. There's a companion technique worth building alongside this one, drawn from the practice of intelligence analysis and formalized by the CIA analyst Richard Sewer under the name analysis of competing hypotheses. Instead of starting with your leading theory and gathering evidence to support it, which is the soldier mindset in disguise, even when it feels rigorous, you lay out every plausible explanation for what you're observing, including ones you find unlikely or unflattering, and then you evaluate each piece of evidence against all of them simultaneously. The explanation that survives the most scrutiny across the widest range of evidence, not the explanation you like first, is the one you provisionally trust. This matters because of a bias called confirmation bias, one of the most heavily documented distortions in cognitive psychology, first rigorously demonstrated in Peter Wayson's card selection experiments in the 1960s. Wayson found that when people are given a rule and asked to test whether it's true, they overwhelmingly seek out evidence that would confirm the rule and almost never seek out evidence that could disprove it, even when the disproving evidence is sitting in plain sight and would resolve the question far more efficiently. We are not built, by default, to hunt for what would prove us wrong. We are built to hunt for what would prove us right, and mistake the abundance of confirming evidence for the absence of disconfirming evidence, which are not remotely the same thing. The practical version of interrogating a belief looks like this. Take a conclusion you currently hold with real confidence, something you'd say out loud in a meeting without hesitation. Write down, specifically, what would have to be true for that conclusion to be wrong. Then, and this is the step almost everyone skips, go look for whether any of those conditions actually exist, using sources or people who have no incentive to simply agree with you. Not people who will tell you what you want to hear. People whose only investment is in being accurate. I do this now with every consequential decision I make, and I'll be honest with you, it's uncomfortable almost every time. There is a specific, physical resistance that shows up when you deliberately go looking for the thing that would prove you wrong, a resistance that feels almost like self-betrayal. That resistance is worth paying attention to, because it's not a sign you're doing something unnecessary. It's a sign you're doing the one thing your mind is specifically built to avoid, and it's exactly the discomfort that separates people who catch their errors in advance from people who catch them, like I did, 11 weeks too late. Reading data without fooling yourself. There's a scene that plays out constantly in boardrooms, doctors' offices, and living rooms across the country, and it goes something like this. Someone presents a number, a chart, a statistic, and the room nods, because numbers feel like the opposite of opinion. Numbers feel like they've already done the thinking for us. This feeling is one of the most reliable ways smart, careful people end up believing things that simply aren't true. Data doesn't lie, but data also doesn't interpret itself, and the gap between a number and what that number actually means is where most reasoning failures involving evidence take place. Consider the distinction between correlation and causation, a distinction almost everyone can recite and almost nobody consistently applies under real conditions. Ice cream sales and drowning deaths rise and fall together throughout the year, correlated almost perfectly. Nobody seriously believes ice cream causes drowning. The actual cause, summer heat, drives both. This example is famous precisely because it's obvious, and its obviousness is exactly what makes it dangerous. It trains people to spot correlation-causation errors only when they're this cartoonish, while missing the same structural error when it shows up dressed in more sophisticated clothing. In my own field, I once saw a team present data showing that employees who used a particular productivity tool completed projects faster than employees who didn't. The conclusion drawn in the room was immediate and confident. The tool improves productivity. We should mandate it company-wide. Nobody in that room, initially, asked the question that actually mattered. Who chooses to adopt new productivity tools in the first place? The answer, once someone finally asked, was uncomfortable. The kind of employee who seeks out and adopts new tools voluntarily is very often already a more organized, more motivated employee to begin with. The tool wasn't necessarily producing faster project completion. A pre-existing trait was producing both the tool adoption and the faster completion, independently. This is called selection bias, and it is one of the most common ways data creates false confidence in a claim that sounds statistically supported but isn't actually demonstrated by the numbers presented. Beyond correlation and selection effects, there's a subtler trap that shows up specifically in how data gets chosen for presentation in the first place, sometimes called survivorship bias. During the Second World War, statistician Abraham Wald was asked to help the military decide where to add armor to returning aircraft, based on a pattern of bullet holes found on planes that made it back from combat. The intuitive answer was to reinforce the areas most riddled with holes. Wald's insight, now taught in nearly every introductory statistics course, was the opposite. The planes that came back showed where a plane could be hit and still survive. The planes that never returned were hit somewhere else entirely, and that missing data, the planes not in the sample because they didn't make it back, was the most important information of all. Reinforcing the areas already covered in holes would have wasted resources protecting exactly the parts of the plane that damage didn't seem to be fatal to begin with. Survivorship bias shows up constantly outside of wartime statistics. Every successful entrepreneur who tells you to follow your passion and take big risks is, definitionally, someone whose risk paid off. You never hear from the enormous, silent population of people who took the same risk and failed, because they're not the ones invited to give keynote speeches. Every self-help framework built on studying only the people who succeeded with a method, without studying the far larger group who tried the same method and failed, is building conclusions from survivors while ignoring the wreckage that never gets counted. The discipline for protecting yourself against these traps isn't complicated, but it requires a specific habit of asking 3 questions every time you're handed a piece of data intended to support a conclusion. First, what's being compared to what, and is that comparison actually fair, or are the two groups different in some meaningful way before the thing being studied even happens? Second, what data isn't in front of me? Who or what failed to make it into the sample, and would including them change the picture? Third, does this data show that one thing caused another, or only that they moved together, and if it's only correlation, is there a more plausible underlying cause driving both? None of these questions require a statistics degree. They require the willingness to slow down at exactly the moment a confident, well-formatted chart makes slowing down feel unnecessary. I've learned, the difficult way, that the moment data feels most persuasive is often the exact moment it deserves the most scrutiny, because persuasive presentation and accurate conclusion are, once again, 2 entirely separate things that we've been culturally trained to treat as one. The trap of agreement, groupthink and social proof. On April 17, 1961, a brigade of Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the Central Intelligence Agency, landed at the Bay of Pigs on the southern coast of Cuba, in an invasion intended to trigger a popular uprising against Fidel Castro. Within 3 days, the operation had collapsed entirely. Nearly the entire invading force was killed or captured. It remains one of the most studied foreign policy disasters in American history, not because the people who planned it were incompetent, but because of exactly the opposite. The room that approved the plan included some of the most capable, most credentialed minds in the United States government. The psychologist Irving Janis studied this failure, along with several others like it, and in 1972 introduced a term that has since become permanent in the vocabulary of organizational psychology, groupthink. Janis defined it as a mode of thinking that takes over a cohesive group when a member's desire for unanimity overrides their motivation to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. In simpler terms, when a group of people likes and respects each other, and values consensus, the group's collective judgment can become measurably worse than the judgment of any single member thinking independently. Not despite the group's competence, but partly because of the social cohesion that competence and mutual respect had built. Janis identified specific symptoms of groupthink, and I want to walk through several of them, because once you can see them, you start noticing them everywhere, including in rooms you're sitting in right now. There's the illusion of invulnerability. a shared confidence within the group that leads to excessive optimism and underestimated risk. There's collective rationalization, where the group discounts warnings and negative feedback rather than reconsidering the plan. There's the illusion of unanimity, where silence from any individual is interpreted by everyone else as agreement, even when that silence actually represents unspoken doubt. And there's the emergence of self-appointed mind guards, members who take it upon themselves to protect the group and its leader from information that might disrupt the shared consensus, often with entirely good intentions. That last symptom, the mind guard, deserves particular attention, because it rarely looks like sabotage. It looks like loyalty. It looks like someone deciding not to raise a concern because they don't want to derail momentum, or because they assume someone more senior has already considered it. In the conference room where my own decision unraveled, I now believe at least one person present had reservations they didn't voice, not out of incompetence or indifference, but because voicing them would have meant disrupting a room that felt aligned, confident, and moving forward together. The social cost of dissent, in that moment, felt higher than the abstract cost of a bad decision that hadn't happened yet. This connects directly to a related but distinct phenomenon studied extensively by the psychologist Robert Cialdini: social proof, the tendency to determine what's correct by observing what other people believe or do, particularly under conditions of uncertainty. Social proof is not inherently irrational. In genuinely ambiguous situations, what other people believe is often a reasonable source of information, especially when those other people have independent expertise. The distortion happens when social proof gets mistaken for independent verification, when a room full of people nodding in agreement gets treated as equivalent to a room full of people who have each separately checked the underlying facts. Those are radically different sources of confidence, and under time pressure, they feel identical. Solomon Asch demonstrated just how powerful this pull toward agreement can be in a series of experiments in the 1950s that have become foundational in social psychology. Participants were shown a simple line-length comparison task with an obvious correct answer, then placed in a group of actors instructed to unanimously give an incorrect answer. Roughly a third of participants, across many trials, conformed to the group's obviously wrong answer at least once, even though the correct answer was visually unambiguous. Asch's experiment is often summarized as showing that people will deny the evidence of their own eyes to avoid the discomfort of disagreeing with a group. What's less often emphasized is how little social pressure was required to produce that effect: a handful of confident strangers in a single room, with nothing at stake beyond momentary social friction. Now scale that dynamic up to a real organization, with actual professional and financial stakes attached to disagreement, and the pull towards silent conformity becomes enormously stronger than anything Asch measured in a laboratory. The practical defense against groupthink isn't cynicism toward your colleagues or a habit of contrarianism for its own sake. Contrarianism without evidence is just soldier mindset wearing a different uniform. The defense is structural. Assign, explicitly, a devil's advocate role before a consequential discussion begins, someone whose job is specifically to argue against the emerging consensus, regardless of their personal view. Ask people to write down their independent judgment privately before any group discussion happens, so early confident voices don't anchor everyone else's thinking before quieter, more careful voices have had a chance to form their own view. And normalize, explicitly and out loud, that raising a concern is a contribution to the group's success rather than a disruption of it, because in every documented case of groupthink, the concern existed somewhere in the room. It simply never found permission to be spoken. Disagreeing without losing the room. There's a specific fear that keeps a tremendous amount of accurate thinking locked inside people's heads instead of spoken into a room where it could actually change an outcome. And it has almost nothing to do with intelligence or conviction. It's the fear of being perceived as difficult, disloyal, or socially costly to work with. Understanding how to disagree effectively isn't a soft communication skill sitting off to the side of critical thinking. It's the delivery mechanism without which even the most accurate internal judgment does no good at all, because a correct thought that never gets voiced changes nothing. The organizational psychologist Adam Grant has spent years studying what separates people who can voice disagreement productively from people whose disagreement either gets ignored or gets them labeled as difficult, and one of his central findings runs against a common intuition. We tend to assume that softening a disagreement, hedging it, wrapping it in excessive politeness, burying it under qualifications, makes it more palatable and therefore more likely to be heard. Grant's research suggests the opposite is often true. Disagreement that's overly hedged frequently gets dismissed as uncertainty rather than received as a genuine, worth considering objection. What tends to actually land is confident, direct disagreement paired with genuine curiosity about the other person's reasoning. Disagreement framed not as "you're wrong," but as "help me understand this piece, because I'm seeing it differently." This connects to a technique with roots stretching back through the philosophy of argumentation, formalized more recently under the name steelmaning, the deliberate practice of stating the strongest possible version of a position you disagree with, stronger even than its original proponent might have stated it, before offering your counterargument. Steelmaning is the direct opposite of the far more common strawman tactic, where you argue against a weakened, easily defeated version of someone's actual position. The reason steelmaning matters for critical thinking specifically, beyond simple fairness, is that it forces you to genuinely understand a position before you dismiss it, which means your disagreement, when it comes, is actually engaging with reality rather than with a caricature you've built for the convenience of feeling right. I've come to believe that the ability to steelman an opposing view before countering it is one of the clearest tests of whether someone is actually reasoning or simply defending. Anyone can argue against a weak version of an opposing idea. It takes real intellectual honesty to state that idea at its strongest, and then still find the flaw. If you can't state the other side's best case in a way they'd recognize as fair, you almost certainly don't understand your own position as well as you think you do either, because understanding why an idea is wrong requires understanding, specifically and completely, what made it seem right in the first place. There's a practical framework worth carrying into any moment where you need to voice disagreement without torching the relationship or the room's trust in you. Lead with genuine curiosity rather than immediate correction. Ask what led the other person to their conclusion before offering yours, because the answer often reveals whether you're actually disagreeing about the facts or about something upstream of the facts, like differing assumptions or differing priorities that have nothing to do with who's reasoning more clearly. State your disagreement as a hypothesis rather than a verdict. I might be missing something, but here's what's giving me pause invites continued conversation in a way that "you're wrong about this" simply shuts down. And separate the idea from the person, explicitly, in your own language. Critique the reasoning, not the reasoner, because the moment disagreement starts to feel like a personal judgment, the other person's cognitive resources shift almost entirely toward self-defense, and productive thinking becomes nearly impossible for both of you. I think often about what would have happened in that conference room if even one person had used this kind of disagreement. Not aggressive, not hedge everything into meaninglessness, but confidently curious. I might be missing something, but what happens in the scenario where our two advisors are agreeing with your confidence rather than independently checking the numbers themselves? That single sentence, delivered with the right blend of directness and genuine openness, might have been enough to interrupt the momentum that carried us straight into a decision none of us, in isolation, would have called safe. Nobody said it. Not because nobody thought it. Because the architecture of that room made silence feel safer than disagreement, and by the time the cost of that silence became visible, it was already far too late to matter. In the next part, we are going to move from recognizing distortions to actively building the mental models that produce clearer judgment under pressure, including the specific practice of thinking in probabilities instead of certainties, and the models that some of the clearest thinkers in history have relied on to stay accurate when the stakes were highest. Thinking in bets, not certainties. There's a particular sentence that almost never gets spoken in business meetings, family arguments, or dinner table debates, and its absence costs us more than almost any other single habit of speech I can point to. The sentence is some version of, "I could be wrong about this." Not as a throwaway disclaimer tacked onto the front of a statement people don't actually mean, but as a genuine, load-bearing part of how a conclusion gets communicated. Annie Duke, a former professional poker player turned decision researcher, built an entire framework around this idea in her work on what she calls thinking in bets. Her core observation, shaped by years at the poker table, is that human beings have a deep, almost involuntary tendency to evaluate the quality of a decision by the quality of its outcome. If something worked out, we assume the decision that led to it was good. If it didn't, we assume the decision was bad. Duke calls this resulting, and she argues it's one of the most persistent errors in how people learn from their own history, because outcomes and decision quality are, in any situation involving uncertainty, two separate things that only sometimes align. Consider a simple example from her world. A poker player goes all in with a hand that has an 80% chance of winning, based on the mathematics of the cards on the table. 80% isn't certainty. It means that roughly 1 time in 5, that hand loses. If it loses on this particular occasion, was the decision to go all in a bad decision? By the logic of resulting, it feels like one. By the actual logic of probability, it was an excellent decision that happened to land on the unlucky 20%, and a player who abandons a strategy of taking calculated 80% bets because one of them didn't pay off is making a far worse long-term error than the person who lost that single hand. This distinction matters enormously outside of poker, because most of the consequential decisions in ordinary life share the same structure. You rarely have access to certainty. You have access to better or worse odds, and the discipline of critical thinking, at its most practical, is largely the discipline of getting honest about what those odds actually are, rather than collapsing everything into a false binary of certain and right or certain and wrong. I've started applying this explicitly, in language, to decisions I make now, and it has changed something subtle but important in how I hold my own conclusions. Instead of telling a colleague, "This will work," I say, "I think this is around a 70% chance of working, and here's what would make me revise that number." The shift sounds small. In practice, it does two things simultaneously. First, it forces me to actually generate a number, which forces me to confront how much uncertainty genuinely exists rather than letting a vague feeling of confidence stand in for a real assessment. Second, it gives everyone else in the conversation permission to disagree with a probability in a way that feels far less threatening than disagreeing with a flat assertion of fact. Nobody feels combative correcting a 70% estimate to 60. Correcting someone's stated certainty feels, socially, like an accusation. There's a related concept from probability theory that deserves a place in your everyday thinking, called Bayesian updating, named after the 18th century mathematician Thomas Bayes. The core idea is disarmingly simple even though the math behind it can get complicated. You should hold a belief with a certain strength based on the evidence available, and when new evidence arrives, you update that belief proportionally, rather than either ignoring the new evidence to protect your existing view or overreacting and discarding everything you previously believed because of one new data point. Skilled forecasters, the ones Philip Tetlock identified as consistently outperforming their peers, are described in his research as unusually good Bayesian updaters. They treat their beliefs as living estimates that shift in small, disciplined increments as new information arrives, rather than as fixed positions defended against all incoming evidence. Most people do something quite different, and it has a name: belief perseverance. Once a conclusion forms, especially one that's been stated publicly or that ties into someone's identity, evidence against it tends to get discounted, reinterpreted, or simply ignored, while evidence supporting it gets absorbed eagerly. The strength of the original belief barely moves, regardless of how much contradicting information accumulates. This is part of why public commitment to a position is so dangerous for clear thinking. The moment you've said something out loud in front of other people, the psychological cost of updating that belief includes not just admitting an error to yourself, but admitting it visibly to everyone who heard the original claim. The practical antidote is to build a habit of stating your beliefs provisionally from the start, before you've had the chance to become attached to them. Not "I believe X," but "my current best estimate is X, and here's what would move me off it." This single linguistic habit does something structurally important. It builds in, from the beginning, the psychological permission to change your mind later without that change feeling like a defeat. You're not abandoning a position. You're doing exactly what you said you'd do from the start, updating a provisional estimate in light of new information. That framing alone removes a tremendous amount of the ego investment that normally keeps people locked into conclusions long after the evidence has stopped supporting them. The models that sharpen judgment. Charlie Munger, the investor and longtime business partner of Warren Buffett, spent much of his public life advocating for an idea he called the latticework of mental models, the practice of accumulating a wide-ranging set of frameworks from different disciplines, and deliberately applying multiple models to any important decision rather than relying on a single favorite lens. His argument, stated bluntly in speeches he gave over several decades, was that people who only have one or two mental tools tend to force every problem to fit those tools, the way, in his famous phrasing, a person holding only a hammer sees every problem as a nail. I want to walk you through a handful of these models specifically, because I've found that having a small, well-practiced set of them ready to apply is one of the most immediately useful upgrades you can make to how you think under pressure. These aren't abstract academic concepts. They're practical instruments, and like any instrument, their value comes from repetition, not from simply knowing they exist. The first is inversion, a technique with roots in the mathematician Carl Jacobi's advice to invert, always invert. Instead of asking how to achieve a goal directly, you ask what would guarantee failure, and then you work to avoid those specific things. This sounds like a small reframing, but it often surfaces risks that direct, forward-looking planning misses entirely, because human optimism naturally biases forward planning toward what could go right. If you want a decision to succeed, spend real time asking what would make it fail catastrophically, then check, honestly, whether any of those conditions are quietly present in your actual plan. The second is second-order thinking, a concept popularized by the investor Howard Marks but rooted in much older strategic and philosophical traditions. First-order thinking asks what the immediate effect of an action will be. Second-order thinking asks what happens after that. What does the immediate effect cause in turn, and what does that secondary effect cause after it? A policy that lowers prices might sound good under first-order thinking. Under second-order thinking, you ask what lower prices do to supply, to quality, to the incentives of everyone operating in that market over the following years. Most consequential failures in business and public policy trace back to decisions evaluated only at the first order, where the immediate, visible effect looked positive and the delayed, less visible second-order effect turned out to be where the real damage was hiding. The third is Hanlon's razor, a simple heuristic that states you should never attribute to malice what can be adequately explained by carelessness, incompetence, or ordinary human limitation. This model matters enormously for clear thinking in interpersonal and organizational contexts, because the mind's default explanation for someone else's frustrating behavior tends to reach for intent. They did this on purpose, they don't respect me, they're trying to undermine this project, when the far more statistically likely explanation is simply that the other person is overworked, underinformed, or operating with constraints you can't see. Applying Hanlon's razor doesn't mean naively assuming everyone always has good intentions. It means defaulting to the less dramatic, more probable explanation before escalating to the more dramatic, less probable one, which alone prevents an enormous amount of unnecessary conflict born from misread intent. The fourth is the map is not the territory, a phrase originating with the philosopher Alfred Korzybski, referring to the fact that every model, every framework, every mental shortcut we use to understand reality is a simplification of that reality, never the thing itself. This sounds obvious, but its implications are frequently ignored, particularly by people who have built successful careers around a particular mental model. A model that worked well in one domain, one era, or one set of conditions is not automatically valid once those conditions change, and one of the most consistent markers of clear thinking is the willingness to notice when the territory has shifted beneath a map you've relied on for years, rather than continuing to trust the map simply because it served you well in the past. I want to be honest about something regarding these models, because I think it matters more than the models themselves. None of them work if they're simply known rather than practiced. I spent months after my own failed decision reading about mental models, feeling genuinely smarter, and then continuing to make the same category of unexamined, overconfident judgment calls in my actual work, because knowing a concept intellectually and reaching for it automatically under real pressure are two entirely different skills separated by a substantial amount of deliberate repetition. What eventually changed things wasn't reading more. It was building a small, boring habit. Before any decision above a certain threshold of consequence, I now literally ask myself, out loud or on paper, what does inversion tell me here? What's the second-order effect? And what would have to be true for me to be wrong? The models only sharpen judgment once they've become reflexive enough to survive contact with actual pressure, and reflexes are built through repetition, not through understanding alone. When experts get it wrong. There's a particular kind of trust most of us extend without much scrutiny, trust in expertise itself. If someone has the credentials, the title, the years of specialized study, we tend to defer, and in a great many circumstances, that deference is entirely reasonable. Expertise, genuinely earned through calibrated feedback over time, is one of the most reliable sources of good judgment available. But the research on expert error tells a more complicated story than simple deference would suggest, and understanding where and why experts go wrong is essential to knowing when to trust expertise and when to interrogate it. Philip Tetlock's forecasting research, which I mentioned earlier, found something specific about where expert judgment tends to fail. It fails least in domains with fast, clear feedback loops, and fails most in domains with slow, ambiguous, or long-delayed feedback. A weather forecaster gets feedback within hours or days, every single time, across thousands of predictions over a career. That rapid, unambiguous feedback loop calibrates judgment extremely effectively, which is part of why meteorological forecasting, despite public jokes to the contrary, has become remarkably accurate over the past several decades. A geopolitical analyst predicting outcomes years into the future, by contrast, may never receive clear feedback at all. By the time an outcome is even partially resolved, dozens of confounding variables have entered the picture, making it nearly impossible to trace a specific prediction back to whether the underlying reasoning was sound. This distinction gives you a genuinely useful practical filter for how much weight to give any expert's confident claim. Ask what kind of feedback loop that expertise has actually been calibrated by. A surgeon's intuition about a specific, familiar type of complication, built from thousands of similar cases with immediate, unambiguous outcomes, deserves substantial trust. The same surgeon's confident prediction about, say, the future of healthcare policy a decade from now is operating in an entirely different, far less calibrated domain, even though it's coming from the same credentialed, intelligent person. Expertise doesn't transfer evenly across domains, and one of the most common reasoning errors ordinary people make is extending trust earned in a narrow, well-calibrated domain to a much broader, poorly calibrated one, simply because the same person is speaking. There's a second, related failure mode worth understanding, sometimes discussed under the heading of the curse of expertise. As people accumulate deep specialized knowledge, they often lose the ability to accurately model what a non-expert doesn't know or see, which can distort their judgment about how confidently a claim should be delivered to a general audience. More significantly, deep investment in a particular framework or theory can create exactly the kind of soldier mindset we discussed earlier, except now armored with genuine expertise and credibility, which makes the resulting overconfidence far harder for anyone, including the expert themselves, to detect or challenge. Max Planck, the physicist, is often credited with the observation that science advances one funeral at a time, a dark but pointed way of noting that even brilliant, rigorously trained scientists frequently fail to update deeply held theoretical commitments in the face of new evidence, and that meaningful shifts in a field's consensus often require an entire generation invested in the old view to retire before a more accurate view can fully take hold. None of this is an argument for dismissing expertise or treating every credentialed opinion with blanket suspicion. That overcorrection produces its own well-documented category of bad thinking, sometimes visible in how quickly people discount well-established scientific consensus in favor of a confident amateur simply because the amateur's claims feel more intuitively satisfying. The goal isn't distrust. It's calibrated trust, built from asking the right diagnostic questions before accepting a confident claim, regardless of who's making it. Has this person's judgment been tested against fast, clear feedback in this specific domain, or are they extending credibility from one area into a different, less calibrated one? Is there a demonstrated track record of updating views in response to new evidence, or a pattern of defending the same conclusions regardless of what's emerged since? And critically, is there any incentive, financial, reputational, or emotional, for this person to be confidently wrong rather than accurately uncertain? I ask that last question more than any other now, because it was, in hindsight, the single most relevant question I failed to ask before that decision years ago. The two colleagues whose confidence I leaned on weren't lying to me, and they weren't incompetent. But neither of them had genuine incentive, in that specific room, at that specific moment, to be the person who introduced doubt into a plan the group had already emotionally committed to. Understanding that incentives shape confidence just as powerfully as evidence does isn't cynicism. It's simply one more variable that clear thinking has to account for, and one that raw intelligence, credentials, and good intentions do absolutely nothing to protect against on their own. Building a mind that audits itself. Everything in this audiobook so far has been in service of a single underlying capability, one that researchers across cognitive science increasingly treat as more predictive of good judgment than raw intelligence itself. Metacognition, the capacity to observe and evaluate your own thinking while it's happening, rather than simply being carried along by it. Intelligence tells you how well you can reason once you've decided what to reason about. Metacognition tells you whether you notice, in real time, that your reasoning has quietly gone off course. The psychologist David Dunning, whose research with Justin Kruger produced the widely known and frequently misunderstood Dunning-Kruger effect, found something more nuanced than the popular version of the finding suggests. The common retelling is that unskilled people are simply too incompetent to know they're incompetent, delivered as a kind of insult toward people with low ability. The more precise and more useful version of the finding is this: the same skills required to perform well in a domain are often the skills required to accurately judge your own performance in that domain. A weak grasp of grammar makes it harder both to write well and to recognize poor writing, including your own. This reframes the entire issue away from a simple story about smart versus dumb people, and towards something more universal and more actionable. In any domain where you haven't built strong calibration, you are structurally unable to accurately judge your own competence in that domain, regardless of how intelligent you are more generally. This is exactly why external feedback, external audit, and the deliberate habits we've covered throughout this audiobook matter so much. They compensate for a blind spot that pure intelligence, on its own, cannot see around. Building a mind that audits itself is not a single technique. It's an accumulated architecture, and I want to close by pulling together the full system, because scattered individually, each tool we've covered is useful. Assembled together, they form something closer to a genuine operating discipline. It starts with noticing the feeling of certainty itself as a signal worth interrogating rather than trusting automatically. Remembering that confidence and accuracy are produced by separate psychological processes that only sometimes align. It continues with sorting decisions by reversibility, applying real deliberation only where the door, once walked through, doesn't open back up, while allowing genuine expertise and calibrated intuition to move quickly where speed is safe. It includes the habit of asking what would have to be true for you to be wrong, specifically and concretely enough that the answer can actually be checked against reality rather than dismissed as vague self-doubt. It includes reading data with attention to what's missing from a sample, not only what's present within it, and holding correlation and causation as separate claims requiring separate evidence. It includes recognizing the specific symptoms of groupthink in rooms that feel unified and confident, and building structural habits, like assigning a genuine devil's advocate, that create permission for dissent before consensus has already hardened. It includes learning to disagree in a way that invites continued thinking rather than triggering defensiveness, steelmaning opposing views before countering them. It includes speaking in calibrated probabilities rather than false certainties, and updating those probabilities honestly as new evidence arrives, without the ego investment that turns a provisional estimate into an identity to defend. And it includes applying a small set of practice mental models, inversion, second-order thinking, Hanlon's razor, the recognition that every map is a simplification, not because they're clever ideas to know about, but because repetition has made them genuinely reflexive under pressure. None of this makes you immune to being wrong. I want to be honest about that, because overselling the promise here would itself be a failure of the very discipline this audiobook is built around. Even with every tool I've described, fully internalized, I still make mistakes, still occasionally feel certain about something that turns out to be false, still catch myself, sometimes only after the fact, having skipped a step I know better than to skip. The goal was never to build a mind that's never wrong. That mind doesn't exist, and anyone promising you that outcome is selling exactly the kind of unearned certainty this entire audiobook has been warning you against. The actual goal, the one genuinely available to you, is a mind that catches its own errors faster, more often, and at a lower cost than it used to. A mind that notices, increasingly early, the specific feeling of a conclusion arriving too quickly, built from too little, dressed up in the costume of certainty it hasn't earned. That's not a dramatic transformation you'll experience all at once. It's a quiet, compounding shift, one interrogated belief, one honestly examined piece of data, one calibrated probability at a time, until one day you notice that a decision which would have swept you along years ago now makes you pause, almost automatically, and ask the question that would have saved me 11 weeks of consequences I'm still, in some ways, accounting for. The day I was certain, and right. I want to take you back one more time to that grey chair on the 14th floor, because I've thought about it so many times since that the memory has become less like a wound and more like an instrument I keep close, something I check my own thinking against. 3 years after that meeting, I found myself in a nearly identical room. Different company, different faces, but the same structural elements present almost precisely. Real-time pressure, colleagues nodding along, the pull of a coherent, comfortable story, and a decision that, if wrong, would be expensive and difficult to reverse. My body registered the same physiological sensation it had 3 years earlier, that warm, settled feeling of certainty beginning to form before I'd actually verified anything at all. This time, I noticed it. Not because I'm smarter than I was 3 years before, and not because the feeling of certainty itself had changed or grown quieter. It hadn't. The feeling arrived exactly as convincingly as it had the first time. What had changed was that I now had a structure standing between that feeling and my mouth, a set of questions I'd practiced enough times that they surfaced almost involuntarily, the way a trained reflex does. What would have to be true for me to be wrong here? Is this a one-way door or a two-way door? Are the people agreeing with me because they've independently verified this, or because agreement is the path of least resistance in this room right now? I ask the questions out loud. I want to be honest that it felt exactly as uncomfortable as it had the first time I tried this practice in a lower-stakes setting, that same specific resistance, like pulling against my own momentum. But I asked them anyway, and the room, instead of moving forward on the strength of my confidence alone, actually stopped. Someone admitted they hadn't checked a number they'd assumed was solid. Someone else raised a concern they'd been quietly sitting on, one they later told me they wouldn't have voiced if the room's default mode had stayed one of confident momentum. We found a real problem, not a catastrophic one, but a genuine flaw that would have cost real money and real trust to discover after the fact instead of before it. We caught it because the room made space for uncertainty instead of racing past it. And I understood, sitting in that near-identical chair, that this was the actual outcome all of this work had been building toward. Not a mind incapable of feeling certain. A mind that no longer mistook the feeling of certainty for evidence of accuracy, and that had built enough structure around that distinction to act on it even when acting on it felt, in the moment, like friction rather than progress. That's what I want to leave you with, more than any single technique or framework we've covered. Critical thinking, in the end, isn't a personality trait some people are born with and others simply lack. It's not even, primarily, a matter of intelligence, since some of the worst reasoning failures in recorded history were produced by rooms full of extraordinarily capable people. It's a discipline, built the way any discipline is built, through specific, repeated, sometimes uncomfortable practice, until the habits that once required deliberate effort become the quiet, automatic architecture of how you meet the world. You will still feel certain about things that turn out to be wrong. That feeling doesn't disappear, and no amount of practice makes you immune to it, because it's built into the basic wiring of how human cognition works. What changes, what can genuinely change, is what happens in the small window between that feeling arriving and your next action. Whether you interrogate it or simply ride it forward. Whether you ask what would have to be true for you to be wrong, or whether you skip that question because everything, in the moment, feels too coherent, too obvious, too settled to need it. I was certain, once, in a grey chair on the 14th floor, and I was wrong, and people I respected paid for that wrongness in ways I still carry with me. Years later, in a nearly identical chair, I was certain again. This time, I stopped to check. This time, I was right, not because certainty itself had become more trustworthy, but because I had finally learned not to trust it blindly in the first place. Earlier, I asked you where you were actually starting from. What's the last thing you were completely certain about that turned out to be wrong? Go back and drop your answer in the comments if you haven't yet. I want to see where this landed for you, and I read every single one. And if this changed even slightly how you think about your own certainty, subscribe. This channel is built for people who take their own minds seriously enough to keep sharpening them. More content like this every week.